JavaScript has some built-in functions that we can basically apply directly on arrays. And these are called methods, and we can think of methods as array operations, basically. So let's now learn some useful array methods. And there are actually countless array methods in JavaScript. And in fact, we have a whole section dedicated to arrays alone. That's how important they are in JavaScript. But in this video, we're going to learn just some basic ones that you really need to know. And also so that you start to get used to the idea of using methods on arrays. Now let's start by bringing back the friends array from the last lecture. All right. And now let's start with a method called push. So the push method adds elements to the end of an array. And so let's say friends dot and then push and then the element that we want to add to the end of the array. So let's say j here. So push is essentially a function, and we can see that by these parentheses. So it's a function that we call, and we call that function really attached to the friends array itself. And that's what this dot here stands for. All right. So again, push is a method, which technically is a function, and we call that function directly on the friends array. So the push function is kind of attached to the friends array. And if you're wondering why that is, we will once more learn that a little bit later in the course. But there is a good reason why this works, and it's actually pretty fascinating stuff. So I hope that you're excited to keep continuing to explore this course until you'll really learn how all of this actually works. Now, anyway, let's now check out the friends array in the console, because this is really all we need to do to add an element to the end of the array. And indeed, now we get the original array that we had before, plus the j element. And you see that the length is now also 4. Okay, so this actually changed, so it mutated the original array, but that's no problem at all, just like I explained to you in the previous lecture. Remember that? All right, now since push is a function here, it can also return something. So we already know that we can pass arguments into functions, and we did that here with j. Then the function can do some work, and in this case, the work that the push function does is to add the element to the array, and actually the push function does return a value. And the value that it returns is the length of the new array. So if we want to capture that data or that value, we can create a new variable for that. So let's call it new length. And let's then also log it to console. And indeed, it is 4. So most of the time we actually don't do this. So we just push an element and call it a day, because usually we don't immediately need the length of the new array. But in case we need it, we don't need to then calculate it separately. We can simply take the result of this function here, store it into a variable, and then use that. Great. Now, besides the push method, which adds elements to the end of the array, there's also a method to add elements to the beginning of the array. So that is the unshift method. So unshift. And so let's say we wanted to add John right to the beginning of this friends array. So again, let's check it out. And so now it should have 5 elements, and the first one should be John. And yeah, it is. And just like the push method, the unshift method also returns the length of the new array. But in this case, we are just not saving it because we don't really need it. Next up, we also have methods to remove elements from arrays. So these one here, add elements. So let me just write that here. Add elements And then we have some to remove elements. And let's start with the pop method, which is basically the opposite of the push method. So this means that pop will remove the last element of the array. So let's write that here. And this time we don't need to pass in any argument. And that's because there's no information needed really to just take out the last element. So let's try that. Oh, we didn't log it again to the console. So let's just grab it from here. And now you see that J is actually gone. And if we did it twice, for example, which of course we can also do, then Peter should also be gone. And indeed, we removed J and Peter. Now again, this pop method also returns something, but this one doesn't return the length of the new array, but instead it returns the removed element. And so that can sometimes be useful. So let's call this one popped, okay? And so let's log that one to the console as well. So that is the popped element. And we could do the same for this first call. But as I said earlier, we don't always do this because it's not always that useful. But here I just want to show you that it actually works. And so the popped element should now be Peter. So this first one here is J, and then the last one becomes Peter. And so here in the second pop call, Peter is the one that's being removed. And so that's the element that's then going to be saved into popped. And yeah, here it is. Okay. And finally, let's also remove the first element from the array. And so that's friends.unshift. So let's copy this one again. Give it a save. And so now only Michael and Stephen should be left after all this manipulation, right? Oh, and actually that did not work. And that's because I did a mistake. So unshift is of course to add elements to the array. And so this one here is called shift and not unshift. So now it should work. Yeah. Once again, we didn't need any arguments. And once again, this method here will return the element that was removed. So if we need that, we can capture it. Next up, there is a very useful method that tells us in which position a certain element is in the array. So let's work with this small array that we have left. And what we want to log to the console now is friends.indexOf. And then we pass the element which we want to reference. So let's say we want Stephen. And so, as I said, this should return the index at which this element is located. So we know that Stephen is right now element number 1, right? So 0 and 1. And we actually can see that here in the console. So 0 is Michael, 1 is Stephen. And so this indexOf function call should return the value 1. Because again, that's the index of the element Stephen. And yeah, there we go. Now, if we try the same thing for an element that is not in there, let's say Bob, we will get -1. All right. And now finally, to finish this, this lecture, there is a very similar method to the indexOf, but which is a bit more modern and, in my opinion, also more useful. So this one is an ES6 method and it's called includes. So includes, instead of returning the index of the element, will simply return true if the element is in the array and false if it's not. So let's check that. So friends.includes. And now we can actually do the same as up here. So let me just copy that. And the difference here is, again, the includes method. So let's see what we get now. And as expected, with Stephen, it is true, because indeed we have one element here, Stephen, but Bob is false, because, well, there is no element called Bob. And this method actually uses strict equality for this check. So let's say that we pushed some value here to this array. So friends.push, which, remember, will add a value to the end of the array. So if we added 23, and then if we checked for 23 the string, it would not work. So it would say false, right? And that's because it is testing with strict equality, which means that it does not do type coercion. And since 23 the string is different from 23 the number, it gives us false. But if I test it directly for the number, then it should be true. And yes, it is. So we added it here to the array, and so then of course the array includes it. That makes sense. And so we can use the includes method to write conditionals. So that's one of the very useful applications of this method. For example, just to test it out very quickly, let's say friends.includes Peter. And then, if so, we can log to the console, you have a friend called Peter. Okay? So we already know that this here returns a Boolean, and we also already know how the if statement works. And so only if this is true, so if the array does include a string with Peter, only then this code is executed. And so right now, of course, nothing happens. But if I ask for Stephen, then here let's say Stephen as well, then I get, you have a friend called Stephen. So that's probably the most used case of the includes method. All right, and that's all I had to show you for this lecture. And as I said in the beginning, there are many more useful methods for manipulating arrays. But for now, I just wanted to show you the most basic ones. And next up, there's yet another coding challenge waiting for you.